Good evening. Welcome back to Price of Power. I'm glad you've found your way here tonight, wherever you are in the world and whatever kind of day you've had. I hope you're comfortable and that there is some quiet around you. If not, that's all right. We'll find it together. Tonight, we're going to travel back to the early years of the 20th century, to a Europe that was older and grander than perhaps it had any right to be. A Europe of emperors and empresses, of palace diplomacy and layered alliances, of young men in pressed uniforms who had never known a real war and, in many cases, believed they wanted one. We're going back to the story of how all of that accumulated pride and ambition and mutual suspicion finally collapsed into something the world had never seen before. This is the story of the First World War. The Great War, as people called it at the time, because they had no name for what would follow. They never imagined there would be anything that followed. Settle in. Let your body grow a little heavier. Let the day begin to drift away slowly. There is no rush. To understand how the world arrived at the summer of 1914, we need to spend a little time in the decades before. The war had been building for years, across multiple fronts at once, economic, military, and political. And tracing that build-up is one of the more clarifying exercises history offers, because the closer you look, the more you see that the catastrophe was not the result of a single decision or a single failure, but of many small ones compounding over time. By the early 20th century, Europe was divided into two major alliance systems, each designed to preserve peace through the mutual threat of overwhelming retaliation. On one side stood the Triple Entente, an alignment between Britain, France, and Russia. On the other stood the Triple Alliance, the arrangement that bound Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy in a pact of mutual defense. Italy would eventually prove to be a flexible partner, but in the years before 1914, the alliance held its shape on the maps and in the calculations of generals. The logic behind both systems was simple enough. If each great power understood that attacking one member meant war with all of them, then no one would risk attacking. It was a theory of peace through deterrence that had kept Europe from a general war for decades. The problem that few fully appreciated was that the logic operated in reverse just as efficiently. When everyone was bound to everyone else, a quarrel between two nations could draw the entire structure into conflict within weeks. As you breathe slowly, consider what Europe looked like in those years. It was a continent that had not experienced a general European war since Napoleon's armies were finally defeated, roughly 100 years before. There had been smaller conflicts, border skirmishes, colonial wars in Africa and Asia, but for the great powers, peace had largely held. And in that long peace, nationalism had grown steadily more intense. The deep belief that one's own people, one's own language and culture, deserved a state of their own had spread across the continent over the 19th century. In Germany, it expressed itself as pride in the newly unified Reich, consolidated only in 1871, still young and determined to establish its standing among the older powers. In France, it expressed itself as a wound, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, a territorial and psychological humiliation that had not fully healed in 4 decades. In the Balkans, where the crumbling Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires were gradually loosening their grip, nationalism expressed itself with particular intensity among the Slavic peoples who had long sought their own unified state. Alongside nationalism, the great powers had been engaged for years in a sustained arms race. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, had significantly expanded its military budget. Between 1910 and 1914 alone, German military spending increased by nearly 79%. Britain, alarmed by Germany's growing naval ambitions, had begun building a new generation of warships, the dreadnoughts, each one representing an enormous investment of steel and national confidence. France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary had each expanded their armies and their arsenals. The continent had armed itself to an extraordinary degree, under the shared assumption that the presence of so many weapons would prevent anyone from using them. That assumption did not survive the summer of 1914. As we move together into that summer, let the weight of the day continue to ease. June in Sarajevo was warm and clear. Sarajevo was then the provincial capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, a region Austria-Hungary had formally annexed from the declining Ottoman Empire in 1908, to the deep frustration of Serbia and the Slavic nationalist movements that believed Bosnia belonged within a unified South Slavic state. The annexation had caused an international crisis which was eventually resolved through diplomacy. Tensions in the region remained as they consistently had, but they had not produced open conflict. June 28, 1914 was a Sunday. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had come to Sarajevo with his wife Sophie, the Duchess of Hohenberg. He was there in his capacity as Inspector General of the Imperial Army. The date selected for the visit carried a significance that his staff appear not to have fully considered. June 28th was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the day Serbian forces were defeated by the Ottoman Empire. It was a date of deep symbolic importance in Serbian national memory, and for Serbian nationalists who resented Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia, the timing of the Habsburg heir's visit was an aggravation. Franz Ferdinand was, by most accounts, a complicated figure. He was not broadly popular within the imperial court, partly because he had insisted on marrying Sophie Chotek, a noblewoman of insufficient rank by Habsburg standards. Their marriage was morganatic, meaning their children could not inherit the throne, and at formal functions, Sophie was required to enter rooms behind the wives of lower-ranking officials. Franz Ferdinand considered this treatment a lasting humiliation. He was known to be proud and at times difficult. He was also, historians now largely agree, one of the most consistent voices for restraint within the Austro-Hungarian government. He had repeatedly argued against military confrontation with Serbia and against adventurism in the Balkans. There is a considered irony in the historical record. The man whose death set the war in motion was among those most opposed to starting one. That Sunday morning, the Archduke's motorcade moved through the streets of Sarajevo. Positioned along the route, among the ordinary citizens who had come to watch the procession, were 7 young conspirators, members and associates of a Serbian nationalist movement that would come to be known as Young Bosnia, with organizational connections to a secret society called the Black Hand, which had ties to Serbian military intelligence. They were armed with pistols and grenades. Earlier that morning, one of the group, Nedeljko Chabrinović, had thrown a grenade at the motorcade. It deflected off the roof of the Archduke's car and detonated beneath the following vehicle, injuring several people. The Archduke's car accelerated away. Chabrinović swallowed a cyanide capsule and jumped into the nearby river, but the cyanide was degraded and failed to take effect, and the river at that point was only a few inches deep. He was arrested. The motorcade proceeded to City Hall, where the scheduled reception took place. Franz Ferdinand was visibly shaken and reportedly departed from his prepared remarks to acknowledge the attack before continuing with the formal program. Afterward, he insisted on visiting the hospital to see those who had been wounded in the grenade explosion. The motorcade set off again through the city streets. The drivers had not been informed of the change in route. They turned onto the original planned road. When the error was recognized, the lead car stopped and began to reverse. In doing so, it came to a halt almost directly in front of a delicatessen on the corner of Franz Josef Street. Standing there was a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip, who had effectively abandoned the assassination attempt and stepped aside for a moment. He found the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne within arm's reach of him. Princip stepped forward and fired twice. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, another struck Sophie in the abdomen. Both died within the hour. Princip tried to shoot himself but was restrained by bystanders. He was too young for the death penalty under Austro-Hungarian law and was imprisoned, where he died of tuberculosis in 1918, shortly before the war concluded. In the weeks that followed, as you settle a little deeper into rest, a regional crisis was transformed into a general European war. The period historians call the July Crisis, the 5 weeks between the assassination and the first declarations of war, is among the most intensively studied passages in modern history. At several points during those weeks, the sequence of events might have gone differently. Messages were misread. Meetings produced no resolution. Ultimatums were constructed with terms that offered little room for compliance. Austria-Hungary, convinced that elements of the Serbian government had been complicit in the plot, intended to use the assassination as justification for a decisive confrontation with Serbia. Before acting, it sought assurance from its principal ally. The German government's response, which historians have called the blank check, offered unconditional support for whatever course of action Austria-Hungary chose to pursue. The blank check removed a significant constraint from Austro-Hungarian decision-making because it eliminated the hesitation that uncertainty about German backing might otherwise have produced. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary presented Serbia with an ultimatum containing demands so far-reaching that many observers at the time recognized them as unlikely to be accepted in full. Among other things, Austria-Hungary demanded the right to send its own officials into Serbia to participate in the investigation of the assassination, a condition that directly compromised Serbian sovereignty. Serbia's response was notably conciliatory. It accepted the majority of the demands. Austria-Hungary declared the response insufficient and on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, declared war on Serbia. The following morning, Austro-Hungarian forces began shelling Belgrade. Russia, which had maintained deep cultural and political ties to Serbia and had stood aside in previous Balkan confrontations in ways it found damaging to its standing, began mobilizing its army. Germany issued an ultimatum demanding that Russia halt its mobilization. Russia did not comply. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, bound by treaty to Russia, began mobilizing as well. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. Germany then began executing the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy calling for a rapid invasion of France through neutral Belgium in order to eliminate France from the war quickly, before turning to face Russia in the east. Germany sent an ultimatum to Belgium demanding passage for its troops. Belgium refused. Germany invaded. Britain, which had guaranteed Belgian neutrality under a treaty dating to 1839, declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. In the space of 5 weeks, a crisis originating in Sarajevo had drawn all of Europe's major powers into a general war. As the night settles more quietly around you, it is worth pausing on what was happening to ordinary people in those first weeks of August. In many cities, the outbreak of war was met not with dread, but with public enthusiasm. Crowds gathered in the streets of Berlin, Vienna, London, and Paris. Young men lined up to enlist in numbers that overwhelmed recruitment offices. A general expectation prevailed among populations that had not experienced a European war in living memory that the conflict would be brief. Military commanders on both sides spoke confidently of operations concluding by Christmas. Soldiers boarded trains decorated with flowers and chalk slogans. Much of this confidence rested on a prevailing belief in the power of the offensive, the idea that modern armies moving rapidly could overwhelm an enemy before it could organize its defense. The German Schlieffen Plan was built around this assumption. It called for German forces to sweep through Belgium in a wide arc, moving south and west into France and then east to encircle Paris, forcing a French surrender within 6 weeks. The plan had been developed and revised over many years. In August 1914, it came close to succeeding. German forces advanced through Belgium and into France at a pace that forced desperate Allied retreats, pushing toward Paris. In early September 1914, at the Marne River east of Paris, the French and British armies turned and mounted a sustained counterattack. The Battle of the Marne ran from September 5th to September 12th and halted the German advance. German forces pulled back to the River Aisne and consolidated their positions. The Schlieffen Plan's central objective, a rapid defeat of France, had not been achieved. Both sides then attempted to outflank the other to the north, each trying to find the open end of the enemy's line and move around behind it. This sequence of maneuvers, which historians call the race to the sea, continued through the autumn of 1914 as the front line extended northward until it reached the Belgian coast. Neither side found an open flank. By the end of October 1914, the Western Front had solidified into a continuous system of trenches running roughly 475 miles from the Belgian coast, south and east to the border of Switzerland. That line would hold, with limited variation, until the final weeks of the war. Consider what that means as you rest and breathe slowly. 475 miles of excavated earth running through the farms and forests and towns of France and Belgium. Men had gone underground because the open ground offered no protection against the volume of fire that modern weapons could produce. The earth was the only thing that could absorb it. The trenches of the Western Front were not a single line of ditches. They were a layered system. The front line trench was where men stood watch, observing the ground between their position and the enemy's. Behind it ran a support trench, and behind that a reserve trench. Communication trenches connected these lines perpendicularly, providing routes for the movement of men, supplies, and orders. The network contained command posts, first aid stations, kitchens, storage areas, and latrines. In some sections, particularly the German positions, there were deep underground bunkers fitted with wooden floors, electric light, and furniture. The German army had designed its trenches with permanence in mind from the beginning, an assumption that shaped how it fought the entire war. Life in the trenches was, by almost any measure, an experience of sustained misery. The trenches were typically 6 to 8 feet deep and a few feet wide, their walls reinforced with timber planks, woven sticks, packed earth, and sandbags. The floors were meant to be lined with raised wooden boards, called duckboards, to keep men above the standing water. But the mud was continuous. In the winter months in Flanders, where the ground is flat and low-lying, rain and artillery fire combined to reduce the earth to something close to liquid. A thick, adhesive mud that pulled at boots, consumed equipment, and in documented cases, drowned soldiers who fell into shell craters and could not be reached in time. Survivors described the sound of the front consistently in their memoirs, not only the detonation of shells, but the approach, the particular quality of the whistle or shriek of each shell type as it moved through the air. Men learned to identify these sounds with considerable accuracy because the trajectory of an incoming shell was information on which lives depended. Beneath the intermittent crash of artillery, the front was never fully quiet. Even in quieter sectors, on relatively calm days, there was artillery fire somewhere along the line, a low, continuous percussion that some veterans said remained audible to them in dreams for decades afterward. As you breathe slowly and let the account continue, consider what daily life meant for the men stationed in those trenches in the first winter of the war. Many had enlisted in August expecting a short campaign. Instead, They stood in mud to their knees, unable to raise their heads above the parapet without risk of a sniper's bullet, existing in a state of persistent physical discomfort and intermittent acute danger, with long stretches of monotony between. A soldier might spend weeks in the line and experience nothing but artillery fire and the daily ritual of standing to arms at dawn, scanning the grey light of no man's land for movement, followed by another unremarkable day. The rhythm of routine was consistent. At dawn and dusk, when visibility was lowest and raids were most likely, all men would stand to and man the parapet. During quieter intervals, there was maintenance to be done, sandbags to be filled, duckboards replaced, reports written. Men slept in brief intervals whenever they could, in dugouts carved into the trench walls or in deeper shelters beneath the trench floor. British soldiers received a daily rum ration. Letters were written home, most of them carefully revised before posting to satisfy the military censor, with no mention of locations or casualty figures or anything that might provide the enemy with useful information. The letters that survive are notable for their ordinariness, full of requests for socks, tobacco and chocolate, and for careful reassurances that everything was more or less fine. Rats were a constant presence. They grew large in the trenches, well fed by the conditions of war, and they were entirely indifferent to the soldiers who lived around them. It was common to wake and find one sitting nearby or nearby on a sleeping man. Flies were a particular problem in summer, moving between the latrines, the food, and the bodies of the unburied dead, who sometimes lay in no man's land for weeks, beyond reach of any recovery party under fire. The smell of the front lines was something veterans consistently described as unlike anything before or since. A combination of mud, explosive residue, rotting wood, human waste, and what survivors referred to simply as the smell of death. The men who inhabited this world came from across the empires and nations involved. British soldiers came from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, India, and the Caribbean. French soldiers came from metropolitan France and from the colonial territories of West Africa, North Africa, and Indochina. German soldiers came from Prussia, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony. Belgian soldiers defended the narrow strip of their own country that remained unoccupied. By the war's end, soldiers from more than 30 nations had served on the Western Front, men who brought with them vastly different languages, expectations, and experiences, and who found in the trenches something that none of their worlds had prepared them for. In the story of the Western Front, there is one episode from its first winter that is worth dwelling on, because it stands apart from the 4 years surrounding it. By December 1914, the opposing trench systems had been established for several months. In some sectors, the distance between German and British positions across no man's land was no more than 50 to 100 yards, close enough to hear voices, close enough to see the glow of fires on the other side. On Christmas Eve, along portions of the British-held line, German soldiers stopped firing and began to sing. Christmas carols carried across the darkness, sometimes accompanied by small lights placed along the German parapet. British soldiers on the other side listened, and in some cases sang back. By the early hours of Christmas Day, men from both sides were climbing out of their trenches and walking toward each other across the ground where they had been killing one another for months. They shook hands, they exchanged cigarettes, uniform buttons, and photographs. They helped each other bury the dead who had lain unburied in no man's land since earlier fighting. Some accounts, preserved in letters and memoirs, describe informal football games played between the lines, though historians note there is no photographic record and the details may have grown in the retelling. What is well documented is that between 30,000 and 100,000 soldiers on both sides participated in some form of informal truce that Christmas, across multiple sectors of the front. By nightfall on Christmas Day, most men had returned to their positions. Some truces continued for another day or two in isolated sections. Then orders arrived from senior commanders on both sides prohibiting any further contact with the enemy, and fighting resumed. Nothing on that scale occurred again in subsequent years of the war. The introduction of poison gas in the spring of 1915 and the progressive hardening of attitudes on both sides ensured that the informal truce of Christmas 1914 remained a singular event. Among the weapons that defined the character of the First World War, perhaps none altered the experience of soldiers on both sides more profoundly than poison gas. Chemical weapons had been prohibited under international agreements dating to 1899, and yet as the war continued and military planners on both sides searched for any means of breaking the deadlock of the trenches, those prohibitions were set aside. The French army was the first to use gas in the war, deploying tear gas grenades in August 1914. German forces fired chemical irritant shells at British positions near Neuve-Chapelle in October of that year. These early uses were small and barely registered. The first large-scale deployment of lethal gas came on April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium. That evening, German forces released more than 150 tons of chlorine gas from approximately 5,700 cylinders positioned along their front line. A favorable wind carried the gas across no man's land toward French and Algerian colonial troops holding that section of the Allied line. Those soldiers had no warning and no protection. They saw a greenish-yellow cloud moving across the ground toward them, rolling low because chlorine gas, being heavier than air, hugs the earth. The cloud reached the Allied trenches and chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system directly, causing burning and choking and killing in sufficient concentrations by asphyxiation. Men ran from their positions, stumbling and gasping, leaving a gap of roughly 4 miles in the Allied line. German commanders were cautious about advancing through their own gas cloud, and the opportunity to exploit the breach closed before it could be used. Canadian troops on the flanks held their positions and helped seal the break, using cloths soaked in urine pressed against their faces as a crude filter, based on the known chemical reaction between urine and chlorine. In the months that followed, both sides developed gas weapons systematically and developed countermeasures at the same pace. Improvised cloth pads soaked in chemicals gave way to manufactured gas masks, first crude and then increasingly effective, produced in enormous quantities. Phosgene, introduced by the Germans in December 1915, was colorless and carried a faint smell of freshly cut hay. It was far more lethal than chlorine, responsible for the majority of gas-related deaths in the war, and it was particularly dangerous because its effects were often delayed. A soldier could breathe a fatal dose and feel only mild irritation. A day or two later, his lungs would begin to fill with fluid. By that point, treatment was largely beyond what field medicine could provide. The total chemical weapons casualties across the war were estimated at roughly 1.3 million, with approximately 90,000 deaths, though these figures are debated by historians. Mustard gas, introduced by the Germans in July 1917, operated differently from the agents that preceded it. It did not primarily kill. It incapacitated. It settled on surfaces and caused severe blistering of the skin, eyes, and airways. A man exposed to it might be blinded temporarily or permanently, and the blisters required weeks of medical treatment, removing him from combat far longer than most conventional wounds would. By design, mustard gas consumed medical resources and degraded fighting strength rather than producing rapid fatalities. During the first 3 weeks of its use, Allied casualties from mustard gas equaled the total chemical weapons casualties of the previous year. One young German soldier suffered a mustard gas exposure near Ypres in October 1918 and spent the remainder of the war recovering from temporary blindness in a military hospital in eastern Germany. His name was Adolf Hitler. That connection is one of many reminders that the First World War did not end with the armistice. Its consequences extended through the following decades in ways that were not yet visible in 1918. Moving deeper into the war's chronology, as you breathe slowly and rest, 1916 is the year that most historians identify as the conflict's pivotal chapter. Two battles on the Western Front define that year, and together they account for suffering on a scale that the participants and later generations have consistently struggled to absorb. The Battle of Verdun began in February 1916, initiated by German commander Erich von Falkenhayn with a specific strategic objective: to engage the French army in a sustained battle of attrition at a location it could not politically or symbolically afford to surrender, and inflict casualties at a rate France could not sustain. The battle continued until December. The area around Verdun was shelled so continuously that the landscape was essentially destroyed, the ground reduced to a surface of overlapping craters with virtually no trace of the fields and villages that had previously occupied it. By the time the fighting ended, both sides had suffered approximately 700,000 casualties. The French held Verdun. The French army came within measurable distance of institutional collapse. The landscape of that region of northeastern France would not fully recover within the lifetimes of those who fought there. Meanwhile, British commander Douglas Haig launched an offensive along the River Somme in northern France on July 1, 1916, partly to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. The offensive was preceded by a week-long artillery bombardment of the German lines, intended to cut the wire barriers, destroy machine gun positions, and leave German defenders too disoriented to mount effective resistance. The bombardment was audible in London. It did not achieve its objectives. German trenches in the Somme sector were among the deepest on the Western Front, in some places 15 meters below the surface, reinforced with concrete and equipped with bunk beds and electric lighting. German soldiers went underground and waited out the bombardment. When it ended, they came back to the surface and manned their machine guns before the British infantry had crossed no man's land. At 7:30 in the morning on July 1, 1916, whistles sounded along the British line and the infantry advanced. In many sectors, they walked rather than ran because the plan assumed the defenders would be neutralized and because the shell-churned ground made running difficult. They advanced into the fire of machine guns that had survived the bombardment intact. 19,240 British soldiers were killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. 38,000 more were wounded. It remains the highest single-day casualty figure in the entire history of the British Army. The battle continued until November 18, 1916, when autumn weather made further offensive operations impossible. Over nearly 5 months of fighting, more than 1 million soldiers on all sides had been killed or wounded. British Empire casualties totaled approximately 420,000. French casualties were around 200,000. German losses were at least 450,000, possibly higher. The ground gained measured roughly 7 miles. The Battle of the Somme did not break the German army and did not end the war. Over the course of those months, however, it imposed cumulative damage on German manpower and institutional capacity that would contribute to the German military's eventual collapse in 1918, and it forced the British Army to develop the combined arms tactics that would prove decisive in the war's final year. On September 15, 1916, during the Somme offensive, the British deployed a new type of weapon for the first time. Armored vehicles capable of crossing trenches and withstanding machine gun fire appeared on a battlefield. The British called them tanks, a deliberately neutral name chosen to obscure their purpose during development. The initial models were slow, mechanically unreliable, and deployed in numbers far too small to be operationally significant. Their psychological effect on German soldiers, however, was considerable. The tank's military potential in 1916 was unrealized. Its eventual role in breaking the deadlock of the trenches was not. Away from the Western Front, the war extended across a considerable portion of the globe. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies fought sustained campaigns against German and Austro-Hungarian forces across a line stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Unlike the Western Front, the Eastern Front remained a war of movement, with territorial gains and losses measured in hundreds of miles. Russia suffered casualties of enormous scale in those campaigns, losses that the Russian state, operating under severe institutional and economic strain, could not sustain. The attrition of the Eastern Front was a significant factor in driving Russia towards the February Revolution of 1917, when Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown, and then the October Revolution, when the Bolshevik Party seized power. In March 1918, the new Soviet government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, withdrawing Russia from the war on terms highly favorable to Germany. The treaty freed dozens of German divisions for transfer to the Western Front, though by the time those transfers were complete, the United States had entered the war and the balance had shifted against Germany. In 1915, the Allies attempted to open a new front by landing forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula in what is now Turkey, aiming to force the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia through the Bosphorus. The campaign, which had been strongly advocated by Winston Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty, did not succeed. Australian and New Zealand troops, known as the Anzacs, landed at what became known as Anzac Cove and fought for months under severe conditions, gaining little ground. The Allies eventually evacuated the peninsula without further significant casualties, a logistical achievement in what had otherwise been a damaging campaign. Total Allied casualties at Gallipoli exceeded 130,000 killed and wounded. For Australia and New Zealand, the campaign became a foundational moment in national memory, marking the first large-scale independent military commitment by both countries. In the Middle East, British and Imperial forces fought the Ottomans across Palestine and Mesopotamia in campaigns that would eventually redraw the region's political map. In East Africa, German colonial forces under Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck conducted a guerrilla campaign that successfully occupied Allied attention for the entire duration of the war. His forces did not formally surrender until 2 weeks after the armistice was signed in Europe, because news of the armistice took that long to reach him in the East African interior. At sea, the war between Britain and Germany was strategically significant in ways that eventually shaped the conflict's outcome. Britain's dependence on seaborne supply of food and raw materials made it vulnerable to submarine interdiction. Germany's U-boat fleet pursued a campaign of commerce raiding aimed at severing Britain's supply lines. In the early years, U-boat operations were constrained by diplomatic caution, particularly the need to avoid attacking neutral shipping. As the war continued and Germany grew more desperate, those constraints were progressively relaxed. In February 1917, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare, declaring that any vessel found in the waters around Britain, regardless of its nationality, was subject to attack without warning. Among the ships subsequently targeted were American vessels, and American citizens were killed. Combined with a German diplomatic initiative disclosed through the interception and decryption of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed to Mexico a military alliance against the United States in exchange for German support in recovering Texas and other territories, American public opinion moved substantially. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. As the night continues, let us consider the war's effect on those who were not in uniform, because the First World War was, in a way that no previous conflict had been, a conflict that reached into every household, every factory, and every community in the nations that fought it. The mobilization of entire economies and populations for military purposes found its modern form in the First World War. Women took on roles that the pre-war period had largely placed outside their reach. With millions of men in military service, the factories producing ammunition, weapons, uniforms, and equipment required workers who were available. Women entered munitions production in large numbers, in conditions that were frequently hazardous, working with explosives and toxic chemical compounds. They worked as ambulance drivers, postal carriers, office workers, and bus operators. In Britain, the Voluntary Aid Detachment deployed tens of thousands of women to work in hospitals and casualty clearing stations, many of them overseas, close to the front lines. By 1917, more than 8,000 female VAD volunteers were working in France. The nurses who served in the war occupied an exceptionally difficult position. Field hospitals and casualty clearing stations were sometimes within range of artillery, and the injuries they treated had no precedent in earlier conflicts. Amputations were routine. Gas gangrene, a severe infection of damaged tissue caused by anaerobic bacteria thriving in shell wounds contaminated by the soil of heavily farmed and fertilized land, was a persistent and frequently fatal condition. Blood transfusion techniques, still experimental at the war's outset, were refined rapidly under the pressure of necessity. Plastic surgery advanced substantially in response to the facial injuries caused by artillery fragments and shrapnel, injuries for which pre-war medicine had no effective reconstruction methods. By the war's end, the American Army Nurse Corps had grown from 573 nurses to more than 21,000. The psychological injuries of the war were less visible, but no less real. 80,000 cases of what was then called shell shock were reported by the British Army between 1914 and 1918. The condition is now understood as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, a clinical response to sustained extreme stress and trauma. Its presentations included physical tremors, paralysis without discernible physical cause, muteness, severe nightmares, and symptoms consistent with what would today be classified as major depression and anxiety disorders. The British military's initial response was inconsistent and often punitive. Some men diagnosed with shell shock were returned to the front. Some were court-martialed on grounds of cowardice. A small number were executed for desertion or refusal to follow orders. Medical understanding of the condition improved as the war continued, but the full psychological accounting of the war would require decades. The First World War produced some of the most significant poetry in the English language, written by men serving in the conflict who felt an obligation to document what they were experiencing. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Rupert Brooke, among others, wrote from within an experience that civilian readers could not easily imagine. Wilfred Owen was killed in action on November 4, 1918, 1 week before the armistice. News of his death reached his family on the day fighting ended. He was 25 years old. His work has remained in continuous circulation for more than a century. J.R.R. Tolkien served in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, lost most of his close friends in that battle, and was evacuated from the front with trench fever. He spent the remainder of his life writing fiction centered on great conflicts between opposing forces, on deep friendships formed under extreme duress, on ancient landscapes bearing the marks of industrial destruction, and on ordinary individuals drawn into events of overwhelming scale. Scholars of Tolkien's work have noted connections between landscapes in his fiction, particularly the dead marshes and the terrain of the Somme battlefield. By the beginning of 1918, several foundational conditions of the war had changed. Russia had signed a separate peace and withdrawn. American forces were arriving in France at a rate of approximately 10,000 soldiers per day. Germany recognized that the growing Allied numerical advantage would become decisive within months and sought to strike before that advantage was fully realized. In March 1918, Germany launched the Spring Offensive, known in German as the Kaiserschlacht. Using infiltration tactics developed by specialized stormtrooper units, German forces achieved breakthroughs across the Western Front that had not been possible for 4 years, advancing up to 40 miles in some sectors. For several weeks, the outcome of the war appeared genuinely uncertain. British and French forces were pushed back, and sections of the front were temporarily separated. The Spring Offensive stalled when German forces outran their supply lines and exhausted their available reserves. Soldiers who broke through Allied positions found themselves in territory with no logistical support, and the offensive lost its momentum. The Allies counterattacked. The 100 Days Offensive, which opened with the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918, was the most operationally effective Allied campaign of the war. Combining infantry, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and cavalry in coordination that the armies of 1914 had not been capable of, the Allies pushed the German army back steadily over the following weeks and months. German General Erich Ludendorff described August 8th as the Black Day of the German army. By autumn 1918, Germany's principal allies, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and Austro-Hungary, had either collapsed or were in the process of doing so. The naval blockade Britain had maintained against Germany since 1914 had produced severe food shortages in the German civilian population. The German Board of Public Health estimated in December 1918 that approximately 763,000 German civilians had died from starvation and related illness as a consequence of the blockade. Within Germany, political stability collapsed. Sailors of the Imperial German Navy mutinied at Kiel in late October rather than sail on a final engagement they considered suicidal. The mutiny spread to other ports and to cities across Germany. Workers' councils formed. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated after 30 years on the throne. A republic was proclaimed. Germany's new government sought an armistice. As the night grows quieter still, we arrive at the moment that 4.5 years of war had been building toward. Representatives of Germany's new government met with Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest, north of Paris, in the early hours of November 11, 1918. At 5 o'clock that morning, the armistice was signed. Its terms required Germany to withdraw its forces from France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, to surrender specified quantities of military equipment, to accept Allied occupation of the Rhineland, and to continue subjecting itself to the naval blockade until a final peace treaty was completed. German prisoners of war would not yet be released. The conditions were effectively those of a military surrender. At 11 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. The silence was, by the accounts of those who experienced it, a disorienting thing. Men who had lived for years under continuous artillery fire heard it stop and stood in their trenches without a clear sense of how to respond. Some wept, others felt nothing, too depleted by the accumulation of the war to respond to news that should have brought relief. Many were skeptical, convinced the firing would resume. Along the Western Front, the reaction ranged from visible celebration to a quiet, almost uncomprehending stillness. Veterans consistently described the 11th hour as one of the strangest experiences of the war, not triumphant and not simply joyful, but strange. Fighting had continued until the moment the armistice took effect, as commanders on both sides maintained pressure until the last interval. On the last day of the war, there were 10,944 casualties. 2,738 men died on November 11, 1918, in the hours between the armistice signing at 5 in the morning and its coming into effect at 11. The last Frenchman killed in the war, a soldier named Augustin Trébuchon, was shot by a sniper at 10:50 in the morning while carrying a message to fellow soldiers informing them that warm soup was ready. He was 22 years old. In the cities of Britain and France, the armistice produced scenes of public celebration. Crowds filled streets and squares, church bells rang, and bonfires were lit. For civilians who had spent 4 years under rationing and waiting for casualty notifications, the end of the fighting brought genuine and immediate relief. In Germany, the response was more complicated. The country was in political upheaval, the Imperial government dissolved, the streets filling with returning veterans who had been told they were winning until very nearly the final weeks. The speed and completeness of the collapse bred a narrative in the following years: the myth of the stab in the back, the claim that Germany had not been defeated militarily but had been betrayed from within by internal enemies. That claim was false, but it was widely believed in Germany through the 1920s and into the 1930s, and it was systematically exploited by political movements that would eventually produce the Second World War. 6 months after the armistice, on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The treaty formally ended the war. It required Germany to accept full responsibility for causing the conflict, under the provision known as Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which became a lasting source of German resentment. Germany was required to pay reparations to the Allied powers, to reduce its military to a small fraction of its wartime strength, and to cede significant territories, including Alsace-Lorraine, returned to France, and the Polish corridor, which separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The German colonial empire was dismantled. Ferdinand Foch, who had commanded the Allied armies in the war's final year, reportedly looked at the completed treaty and said, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." The observation proved accurate to within 2 months. 20 years and 2 months after the Versailles signing, Germany invaded Poland. The First World War claimed approximately 9 million soldiers' lives. 21 million more were wounded. At least 5 million civilians died from disease, starvation, and exposure. 4 empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian, collapsed during or immediately following the war. The map of the world was substantially redrawn. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire left a political vacuum in the Middle East that Britain and France filled with new borders and new arrangements, the consequences of which remained active well into the 21st century. The Russian Revolution, which the war had significantly accelerated, produced the Soviet Union, which would reshape the second half of the century. In the smaller registers of the historical record, the war is present in a different way. In the story of Gavrilo Princip, who stepped outside a delicatessen in Sarajevo on a Sunday morning and found history directly in front of him. In the story of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, who died together in an open car on a clear June day in a city their imperial government had made hostile. In the story of the soldiers on both sides who climbed out of their trenches on Christmas Eve 1914 and walked across no man's land with open hands. In the story of Wilfred Owen, killed a week before the war ended, his work outlasting him by more than a century. In the story of Augustin Trébuchon, who died at 10 minutes to 11 on the last day of the war, carrying a message about soup. As we reach the end of tonight's account, let the images settle. The Western Front, 475 miles of trenches running through the farmlands of France and Belgium, is silent now. Forests have grown back over the shell craters. The farmhouses have been rebuilt. Children play in fields where armies once fought. The earth still yields unexploded shells, turned up by plows each year, in a process that continues more than a century later. The cemeteries from the war are among the most carefully maintained landscapes in Europe, long rows of white stones stretching across carefully tended ground, each one marking a name, or where the name has been lost, the inscription known unto God. The last verified veteran of the First World War died in 2012. The generation is gone. What remains is what they left behind in letters and diaries, in poems and photographs, in the borders of nations, and the unresolved grievances that the war planted, and in the annual ceremonies of remembrance observed every November 11th, when people in dozens of countries pause for 2 minutes of silence at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That silence carries a considerable weight. It holds 4 years of sustained industrial warfare and the unusual quiet that came when it finally stopped. It holds the record of 9 million dead and 21 million wounded, the nurses and the generals and the farmers and the young men who became soldiers because their world required it of them, who entered something none of them had been prepared for and carried it for the remainder of their lives. History is not only the account of empires in collision or alliances under stress or strategies unfolding on a map. It is the record of individual people caught in conditions larger than themselves, making the decisions available to them in the particular moment they happen to occupy. A 19-year-old standing in front of a delicatessen, an archduke insisting on visiting the wounded before continuing on his route, a soldier in Belgium in December 1914 deciding to climb out of his trench and walk toward the other side. Tonight, as you rest and the story of the Great War recedes, perhaps you will carry something of it with you into sleep. Not only its horror, but its persistent human texture. The men who wrote careful letters home, the women who learned to work in conditions medicine had not anticipated, the soldiers who sang across no man's land on a cold December night because they were tired and it was Christmas, and for a moment they remembered what ordinary life had been. History holds all of them. It is in the end the accumulated record of human beings attempting to live and understand in a world that does not always cooperate. Sleep well. And thank you for being here tonight. If you've made it this far through the story of the Great War, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Price of Power, so these histories can continue to reach people who want to hear them. If there's a period or event you'd like to explore together, leave it in the comments. Rest well, wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. 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 I'll see you next time.